Texas, 2009. A cold case finally solved. Clara Elise Montoya, 26, a preschool teacher beloved by her students, vanished after a quiet Sunday service. Her abandoned car, door ajar, sat roadside like a question mark in the dust. For over a decade, silence followed. Dead ends, lost evidence, and rumors of police misconduct. Until now. A single DNA breakthrough changed everything. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the quiet heart of Red Grove, Texas, a town with fewer than 4,000 residents and a single stoplight, Clara Elise Montoya lived a life filled with purpose, though few would have ever called it extraordinary. She didn't seek attention. She didn't crave the spotlight. But for those who knew her, Clara was unforgettable. At 26, she had already touched more lives than many do in a lifetime. Clara was a preschool teacher at the Red Grove Methodist Church, where she led a class of rambunctious 4- and 5-year-olds with a warmth that seemed to radiate from her smile. Her classroom walls were covered in finger-painted rainbows and macaroni art. Her voice, gentle but confident, calmed children mid-tantrum and made even the shyest toddler feel seen. She had a gift, not just for teaching but for understanding people. At home, Clara lived with her parents, Eduardo and Marta Montoya. Both retired educators themselves, they often joked that Clara had inherited the calling, a soft strength, a belief that shaping young lives was holy work. She helped her mother cook tamales on weekends, and every Wednesday night she led the children's choir rehearsal at church. Sundays she sat in the second pew beside her father, always singing hymns just slightly off-key, but with complete devotion. Neighbors described her as the kind of person you want your kid to grow up to be. She volunteered at the local food pantry, brought soup to the elderly, and offered tutoring to struggling kids. Her world was small but meaningful. In a place like Red Grove, where people often stayed forever or never looked back, Clara was one of the rare few who stayed by choice, because she believed in community. But beneath the sweetness and structure of her daily life, subtle changes had started to emerge. In the weeks before she disappeared, her parents noticed Clara seemed a little more withdrawn. She spent more time alone in her room. She stopped joining her father on morning walks. She had always been a writer. Small poems, sketches, private thoughts. But now her journal entries seemed more frequent, more intense. Her mother found one lying open on her desk and saw a page filled with words scratched out so hard the paper had torn. She was thinking a lot about something, Marta would later say, something she didn't feel like she could share with us. Clara hadn't been dating anyone seriously, not since a short-lived relationship with a youth pastor the previous year. Friends said she hadn't mentioned anyone new. There was no obvious stress at work, and the church community remained as tight-knit as ever. But Clara was human. She carried burdens like anyone else. She simply chose not to show them. That was her way to protect others from worry. On the last Friday of April 2009, Clara stayed after school later than usual. She told another teacher she was reorganizing supplies. But when her coworker checked in on her, Clara was staring out the window, her face unreadable. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Everything okay?" the teacher asked. Clara nodded. "Just tired, that's all." It would be the last time anyone outside her family spoke to her at length. By the time May rolled around, Clara was still attending her usual commitments: choir practice, lesson planning, Sunday service. Outwardly, everything seemed the same. But something had shifted beneath the surface, a secret weighed heavy. A decision unspoken, a change invisible but seismic, had quietly taken root in Clara's life. What had changed in Clara's world that no one noticed? And would it hold the key to what happened next? Sunday, May 3, 2009 began like any other for Clara Elise Montoya. The morning was bright, the air soft with the promise of spring. Clara arrived at Red Grove Methodist Church a little after 8 a.m., carrying a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite. She arranged them on the altar herself, humming a hymn under her breath as she placed each stem just so. She wore a pale blue dress and a delicate silver cross necklace, both of which she'd worn dozens of times before. Familiar, comfortable, normal. Those who saw her that morning remembered nothing unusual. Pastor Ramirez said she looked a little tired but peaceful. A fellow teacher mentioned that Clara had seemed more reserved than usual, but figured it was just the end-of-week fatigue. The service ran until noon, and after coffee and fellowship in the church hall, most attendees headed home. But Clara stayed behind. She helped fold chairs, rinse communion cups, and take out the trash. The quiet work she often did without being asked. By 2:30 p.m., the church was nearly empty. Clara stepped outside into the sunlight, pulling her phone from her purse. At 3:01 p.m., she sent a text to her mother. "Home in a bit. Love you." That would be the last anyone heard from her. Hours passed. Dinner time came and went. Marta Montoya set the table, expecting her daughter to walk through the door. When she didn't, worry began to nibble at the edges of her thoughts. Clara was never late. She always checked in. By 6:00 p.m., her parents began calling. No answer, straight to voicemail. Eduardo drove toward the church, hoping maybe she had stayed longer than expected. But the building was locked and dark. No sign of Clara. At 7:12 p.m., a sheriff's deputy received a call from a rancher named Glenn Horner, who had spotted an unattended vehicle near County Road 218, a narrow, unpaved road winding through brush country a few miles outside of town. The vehicle matched the description of Clara's beige Toyota Corolla. The car was parked at an awkward angle, partially on the shoulder, with the driver's side door wide open. Inside sat Clara's purse neatly placed on the passenger seat. Her cell phone was missing. The keys were still in the ignition. The engine was off. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no skid marks, no signs of forced entry. But something felt wrong. It was as if she had stepped out and simply disappeared into the dry, whispering brush. By 8:30 p.m., police had cordoned off the area with yellow tape. Flashlights bobbed through the trees as officers and volunteers searched the terrain. Helicopters from nearby counties were called in. Dogs were brought in to track any possible scent, but the trail went cold within minutes. There were no footprints, no torn fabric, no blood. The search expanded through the night. Dozens of volunteers from the church, the school, and neighboring towns showed up. They combed ditches, climbed barbed fences, and scanned creek beds. But the only thing they found was silence. News of Clara's disappearance spread fast. By morning, every home in Red Grove knew. Parents whispered warnings to their children. Local businesses printed flyers. Church groups held prayer vigils. The idea that someone like Clara, kind, gentle, utterly safe, could simply vanish unsettled everyone. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a symbol of goodness in a town that valued tradition, trust, and faith. So why had she driven out to that lonely stretch of road? It wasn't her usual route home. It led away from town. She had no known reason to be there, and most disturbing of all, who had seen her last? And what happened between her final text and that empty driver's seat? It was a quiet Sunday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Clara Montoya had vanished, when a hiker named Darren Cole set out for a walk through the brush trails near a dry creek bed known to locals as Devil's Hollow. The area was rugged, full of thornbush mesquite and winding deer paths that stretched beyond the town's edge. Darren, a retired postal worker, often came here for solitude. But what he stumbled upon that morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. Near the bend of the dry creek, partially obscured by wild brush and loose earth, he noticed something unnatural, a patch of disturbed soil, a faint glimpse of fabric, and a smell that made his stomach turn. He called 911 immediately, his voice shaking. Authorities arrived within the hour and quickly cordoned off the area. Carefully, they uncovered a shallow grave. The remains were fragile, the body twisted unnaturally, but the soft blue fabric of the dress was unmistakable. Beside the remains, buried in the dirt, was a broken silver cross necklace, the same one Clara had worn to church that morning. Dental records would later confirm what most already feared. The body was Clara Elise Montoya. The medical examiner's report revealed blunt force trauma to the head and neck, consistent with a violent assault. Clara also had defensive wounds on her forearms and hands, deep bruising and fractures. She had fought back. She hadn't gone quietly. There were no signs of sexual assault, no drugs in her system. Time of death was estimated to be the same day she went missing, within hours of her last text to her mother. News of the discovery spread like wildfire through Red Grove. The community, already on edge, sank into collective grief. The church held a candlelight vigil that evening. Children placed drawings and flowers at the steps of the preschool where Clara had taught. Her parents, Eduardo and Marta, stood in silence, clutching each other, hollow-eyed. The image of their daughter's last known moment was now filled with horror. Investigators canvassed the surrounding area for evidence. Forensic techs combed the burial site inch by inch but came up with little. No weapon, no tire tracks, no cigarette butts or discarded items. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Redgrove had no surveillance infrastructure in its outer rural areas, and the road where Clara's car had been found had no cameras, no traffic sensors, nothing to track who might have been on it that day. Officers interviewed everyone from her church circle to her former students' parents. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had a solid lead. Her phone was never recovered, but whispers had begun to spread. Some believed Clara must have known her killer, perhaps had accepted a ride. Others feared it had been a stranger, someone who had passed through town and vanished, never to be seen again. A traveling worker, a drifter, someone invisible. The rumors took on a life of their own. An elderly man who often sat alone at the diner was quietly avoided. A handyman who had done work at the church was questioned twice. But with no evidence, nothing stuck. The town's sense of safety was broken. Parents no longer let their children walk to school. Church attendance dropped. Clara's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a rupture in Redgrove's identity. And still the question lingered. Why Clara? She had no enemies, no known disputes, no troubled history. But someone had ended her life with violent intent. With no clear suspect and no motive, where would the investigation turn next? In the weeks following the discovery of Clara Montoya's body, the Redgrove Police Department found itself under immense pressure. The public demanded answers. The Montoya family demanded justice, but the investigation, which had begun with urgency and public cooperation, quickly started to unravel under its own weight. The first round of interviews focused on the church staff, congregation members, co-workers, and Clara's close circle. Investigators hoped to identify a suspect from within, someone Clara might have trusted enough to follow, or someone harboring a hidden obsession. But nothing concrete surfaced. No arguments, no threats, no troubling behaviors. Clara's ex-boyfriend, David Salinas, a youth minister from a nearby town, was brought in for questioning. He admitted they hadn't spoken in months. His alibi, being out of state visiting family the weekend of her disappearance, checked out. Tips began pouring into the police hotline, especially after media outlets picked up the case. Some callers claimed to have seen Clara's car on a different road. One woman insisted she had seen Clara in a dream and knew exactly where the killer lived. Others offered rumors, speculation, and names, but little of real substance. Then came troubling signs that not all was well inside the investigation. Whispers began circulating among courthouse clerks and police staff. A piece of torn clothing, found near the creek where Clara's body had been buried, had allegedly been recovered during the initial forensic sweep, but it had never been entered into the official evidence log. Another officer mentioned that a bloody fingerprint had been collected from the inside of Clara's car, but that the print was badly smudged during lab processing, rendering it unusable. When reporters pressed the department for clarity, spokespeople gave vague answers. Behind closed doors, one of the lead detectives was quietly transferred to administrative duties. The reason, never officially stated, was widely believed to involve procedural negligence. Clara's family, increasingly disillusioned with the investigation, hired a private investigator, a former state trooper named Lionel Bridges with a reputation for persistence. But even he hit walls. "I've worked dozens of cold cases," Bridges would later say, "but I've never seen a department so disorganized." Evidence was missing. Reports were incomplete. It was like trying to build a puzzle with half the pieces gone. The Montoyas held press conferences. They pleaded with the public for help. They mailed flyers across county lines. But the momentum had slowed. The initial urgency had faded, replaced by bureaucratic fog and institutional silence. Redgrove, once unified in grief, began to fracture. Suspicion turned inward. Residents questioned not just each other, but those sworn to protect them. Parents avoided eye contact in grocery store aisles. Children overheard conversations they couldn't quite understand. Fear seeped into the town like a slow-moving flood. The community had wanted closure. Instead, they were left with doubt, and a growing suspicion that Clara's case might quietly disappear into a filing cabinet, never to be solved. For Eduardo and Marta Montoya, the weight of uncertainty became unbearable. Every day was a test of faith. Every unanswered question a wound that refused to heal. Behind the scenes, the cold case file grew thicker, not with progress, but with dead ends. And through it all, one truth remained. The person who had taken Clara's life was still free, still unaccounted for, still living among them, or perhaps long gone. Would this case be buried under layers of missteps and forgotten evidence? Or would someone someday bring it back into the light? By the end of 2010, the investigation into Clara Montoya's death had gone silent. The early waves of public outrage had ebbed. The news coverage stopped. Leads had run dry, and the detectives who once crowded the hallways of the Red Grove Police Department had quietly moved on to fresher cases. Clara's file, once labeled active, was now boxed, stored, and slowly collecting dust on a shelf marked unsolved. Red Grove, like any small town, returned to its routines. The preschool where Clara had taught eventually reopened her classroom. It was repainted with soft yellows and blues, new posters hung, new furniture brought in. A new teacher stepped into the role Clara had once filled, quietly, respectfully. Her name was never spoken aloud by the youngest children, most of whom had barely been old enough to remember her. But for their parents, Clara's memory remained a raw ache. At home, Eduardo and Marta Montoya refused to accept that this was the end. Every May 3rd, the anniversary of Clara's disappearance, they lit a single white candle in their living room window. It stayed burning until morning. It was a ritual of remembrance, a silent beacon of hope, and an act of defiance against time's slow erasure. They kept Clara's room exactly as she'd left it. Her journals remained stacked neatly on her nightstand. Her clothes hung untouched in the closet. Her favorite book, a tattered copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, stayed on her pillow. Marta often found herself rereading Clara's handwritten entries late at night, searching for anything that might make sense of her daughter's final weeks. A cryptic sentence, a name, a clue, but the pages were filled only with fleeting reflections, some cheerful, others anxious, none conclusive. Eduardo channeled his grief into quiet activism. He began attending community meetings across the state, advocating for increased funding for cold case units. He learned how DNA technology was evolving and how legislative pressure could prompt reviews of old files. At vigils, he'd speak softly but firmly, calling for accountability, urging that no case and no daughter should ever be forgotten. Red Grove, meanwhile, held on to Clara's story in its own quiet way. Her photo remained on the wall of the church hallway, a smiling young woman surrounded by children. Her name was spoken in hushed voices, passed between generations like a solemn prayer. The teacher who vanished, they said. The one who was too good, too kind to deserve what happened. And still the questions festered. Who had driven her to that remote stretch of road? What happened between the church parking lot and that dry creek bed 6 miles away? Why had her life been stolen? And how had the killer vanished so completely? Some residents believed she had known her attacker, that trust had been betrayed. Others insisted it was random, a drifter, a man just passing through, but no theory held up under scrutiny. The case remained a vacuum of truth, full of possibilities but void of answers. As the years slipped by, other cases took precedence. New crimes captured headlines. Clara's name was mentioned less and less. Even among those who had once marched in her memory, silence became easier. But her parents never gave up. Somewhere out there, they believed, someone knew what happened. Someone had seen something. Someone had heard something. Someone had walked away from a crime that shattered a family and scarred a town. Would Clara's story slowly fade into forgotten headlines and fading memories? Or could a breakthrough still rise from the shadows of the past? 12 years after Clara Montoya's murder, in a world transformed by science and technology, the silence was finally broken. In early 2021, the Texas Department of Public Safety launched a statewide initiative to revisit long-dormant cold cases using emerging forensic genealogy tools. The initiative, fueled by both public demand and private grants, partnered with a newly formed task force specializing in analyzing old evidence through a cutting-edge lens: mitochondrial DNA sequencing and genealogical mapping. Clara's case was one of hundreds selected for review, but something in her file stood out. Back in 2009, investigators had recovered trace DNA beneath Clara's fingernails. At the time, the sample was considered too degraded to be useful. It was logged, sealed, and ultimately shelved. But with 2021's forensic advancements, even degraded mitochondrial DNA could tell a new story. The lab extracted the old sample and began running it through national and genealogical databases. Days turned into weeks, and then a hit. It wasn't a direct match to a criminal profile, but a familial one, a genetic link to someone in the system. Through reverse genealogy, researchers traced the DNA to a distant cousin, then another, building out a tree that eventually pointed to one name, Thomas Ray Hollowell. The name triggered curiosity within the task force. Hollowell, now 49 years old, had lived and worked throughout rural Texas in the early 2000s. One piece of data made investigators pause. In 2009, Thomas Hollowell had been employed by a local roofing contractor in Red Grove. That same year, the contractor had been hired to perform repairs on the Red Grove Methodist Church, Clara's church. Digging into records, they confirmed Hollowell had spent 3 weeks in Red Grove that spring. Quiet, unassuming. He had a clean criminal record. No violent offenses, no known run-ins with law enforcement. But he had proximity, and now possibly a DNA link to Clara's last moments. Investigators obtained a discarded coffee cup from Hollowell's trash in Denton, where he now lived under the radar, working night shifts as a warehouse custodian. They sent the sample to the lab. The results came back. A conclusive DNA match to the genetic material found under Clara's fingernails. The silence that had lingered for over a decade was shattered in an instant. Detectives immediately began compiling a timeline. Hollowell had no known relationship with Clara, but he had been on church grounds. He had likely seen her. Was he watching her from afar? Had something triggered his actions? More troubling questions arose. Why had he been overlooked in 2009? His name hadn't appeared in any witness statements or church staff interviews. Had he flown under the radar completely? Just another face among the contractors? The evidence was circumstantial, but the DNA was not. Still, a deep, sobering reality settled in. DNA alone doesn't prove murder. It placed him in contact. It suggested a struggle. But it didn't explain the how or the why. Had there been motive? Had Clara known him at all? Had anyone seen them speak? The team now faced the challenge of turning this genetic key into a full picture of guilt. Investigators began tracking Hollowell's employment history, his movements in 2009, and anyone who might recall seeing him at the church. They dug through old personnel records, church volunteer lists, even dusty maintenance logs from the spring of Clara's death. The Montoyas were notified. It was a moment they had both prayed for and feared. An answer, but one that raised new impossible questions. Could they prove more than DNA? Could they prove intention, malice, and murder? And would this discovery finally bring justice, or only more shadows? On the morning of March 14, 2022, the quiet streets of a Dallas suburb were interrupted by a team of unmarked vehicles pulling into a modest apartment complex. The target wasn't a fugitive, a known felon, or a man with a lengthy rap sheet. It was 49-year-old Thomas Ray Hollowell, a man who, until that moment, had lived in obscurity. Hollowell was arrested without incident. He had been leaving his apartment to start his night shift at a local warehouse when officers moved in. He looked confused, even stunned, but offered no resistance. Within hours, his mugshot, pale, weathered, eyes wide with disbelief, was plastered across Texas news outlets. The headline hit like a punch: Arrest made in 2009 cold case murder of Clara Montoya. For the residents of Red Grove, it was a name that felt like a ghost. Most had forgotten Hollowell, if they'd ever noticed him at all. But as reporters and investigators retraced his presence, it became clear. He had been there. He had been around. He had worked for a local contractor that repaired the church roof in early 2009. He'd attended the spring picnic. He even fixed a clogged drain in the preschool bathroom just weeks before Clara's death. Photos resurfaced, group shots from church events blurred and faded, and there he was. In the background, always around, always unnoticed. He had no personal connection to Clara, no known communication, but that's what made the truth even more chilling. He had blended in so easily. For Clara's parents, the news of Hollowell's arrest was devastatingly complex. Eduardo and Marta Montoya stood before reporters that same afternoon. Eduardo's voice trembled as he read a statement. "For 13 years, we've lived with a hole in our hearts. We prayed for justice. Today, we took a step toward it." Marta, tears streaming down her face, could barely speak. "She was so good," she whispered. "So good, why her?" Their grief was raw. Their relief complicated. They had spent over a decade imagining this moment. And now, standing in front of cameras, they were face to face with the reality that Clara's story had never ended. It had simply been paused. The arrest reopened old wounds for the entire community. Redgrove, which had long tried to heal, was once again forced to confront its darkest chapter. Conversations returned to the night Clara disappeared. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years began to share memories, suspicions, theories. The church released a statement calling the arrest a long overdue reckoning and offered support to the Montoya family. Clara's former students, now in high school or college, took to social media to honor the woman who had shaped their early years. But amid the waves of emotion, one looming reality cast a long shadow. An arrest was not a conviction. Prosecutors began building their case. The DNA evidence was strong, a match taken from under Clara's fingernails. But the defense would surely argue contamination, error, or coincidence. Hollowell's past was clean. He had no history of violence. No known motive. Public opinion was divided. Some were certain the DNA didn't lie. Others feared it wouldn't be enough. After so many years, memories fade, evidence degrades, and doubt creeps in. One question echoed across every kitchen table, courtroom hallway, and news studio. As the trial loomed, would the jury see the truth, or would reasonable doubt let a killer walk free? In November 2023, nearly 15 years after Clara Elise Montoya's life was stolen, the trial of Thomas Ray Hollowell began in a packed Texas courtroom. Seats were filled with reporters, former neighbors, church members, and Clara's surviving family. Eduardo and Marta Montoya sat in the front row every day, faces steeled by grief and determination. Their daughter's memory had endured more than a decade of silence. Now her voice would echo through testimony and truth. The prosecution opened with clarity and force. They walked the jury through Clara's final hours, the church service, her last text to her mother, the abandoned car, and ultimately, the shallow grave. Then came the forensic bombshell. DNA recovered from beneath Clara's fingernails, matched to Hollowell using advanced mitochondrial sequencing. The lead forensic analyst explained how the sample, once deemed unusable, had become a cornerstone of the case thanks to scientific advancements. The chain of custody was verified, the testing methodology detailed. The results were, as the prosecution repeated, statistically undeniable. But the defense fought back hard. They cast doubt on the reliability of degraded DNA. They questioned the integrity of the original evidence collection, citing rumors of mishandled files from 2009. They argued that Hollowell, who had once worked at the church, could have come into contact with Clara in a non-violent setting. There was no eyewitness, no murder weapon, no confession, and most critically, no motive. He had no reason, the defense attorney told the jury. No relationship with her, no history of violence. Are we ready to send a man to prison for life based on degraded biological material alone? But prosecutors weren't finished. They introduced excerpts from Clara's journals read aloud in the courtroom. In one entry just weeks before her death, Clara described a growing sense of unease, of someone watching her during her work at the church. She didn't name Hollowell, but the implication was chilling. Then came a key witness, a former co-worker from the church preschool. She recalled Hollowell during his roof repair work in spring 2009. He rarely spoke, avoided eye contact, but once, she remembered, he lingered too long in the hallway outside Clara's classroom. She described catching him staring through the glass, not just watching but fixating. It had unsettled her then. Now it felt like a missing puzzle piece. The courtroom was tense. Jurors listened carefully. The weight of 13 years pressed against every word. After closing arguments, the jury was sequestered. 2 days passed. Then, the verdict. Guilty. Thomas Ray Hollowell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Montoyas wept in the hallway outside the courtroom. Reporters asked how they felt. Eduardo answered quietly, "We're grateful, but there's no such thing as closure. Just truth, and now we have it." Clara's friends gathered outside that evening with candles humming her favorite hymn. A mural painted on the school wall, Miss Clara's garden, became a shrine of flowers and notes. But beneath the solemn victory, a truth lingered. Justice had been served, but it had taken far too long. Clara's killer had walked free for over a decade. Evidence had sat unused. Questions had gone unanswered. The verdict brought relief, but also a haunting awareness of the fragility of justice. And so, the town of Redgrove looked forward uncertain. What legacy would this trial leave behind but for a town still healing, and for the countless other cold cases waiting in the dark? In the weeks following the verdict, something extraordinary began to unfold in the quiet town of Redgrove. Where grief had once hollowed out the heart of the community, something new was beginning to take root: purpose. Clara Montoya's parents, Eduardo and Marta, didn't retreat into the shadows of memory. Instead, they channeled their pain into action. In January 2024, they launched the Clara Grace Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to honoring Clara's legacy in the two areas she loved most: education and justice. The foundation offered scholarships to aspiring teachers across Texas, young people driven by the same kindness, patience, and integrity Clara had once poured into her students. At the same time, it funded cold case initiatives, helping rural counties obtain access to modern forensic technology, including genealogical testing and digital case tracking. The Montoyas partnered with legislators in Austin, advocating for the creation of a statewide cold case task force. Their voices, once quiet, private, now echoed in hearings and policy meetings. Within months, new legislation passed, allocating funds to revisit unsolved cases like Clara's, giving hope to families who had waited too long in silence. Back in Redgrove, Clara's story was no longer just spoken in whispers or framed in sadness. It became a symbol of perseverance, a beacon for what community and compassion could accomplish when combined with persistence. At a memorial service held on what would have been Clara's 41st birthday, former students filled the church pews where she had once sung and prayed. One young woman, now a mother herself, stood at the podium, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Miss Clara taught me how to hold a pencil," she said. "Now I'm holding my baby girl, and everything I teach her, every bedtime story, every song, carries the kindness Miss Clara gave me." Others shared how Clara had helped them through speech delays, separation anxiety, or just the quiet sadness of growing up. She had made them feel safe, seen, and loved. That kind of impact doesn't fade with time. It echoes forward. Outside the church, the town unveiled a living memorial. A flowering dogwood tree planted just beside the playground Clara had once supervised. A small plaque at its base read, "In memory of Miss Clara, a teacher, a light, a legacy." Every May the tree blossoms with delicate white petals. Every May, children gather beneath its shade, unaware that they play in the footprint of someone who once protected innocence with gentleness and grace. Redgrove changed after Clara's case. Not just in grief, but in determination. The church began offering self-defense classes. The school district implemented new safety measures. A mural painted by local artists and students now stretches across the preschool's outer wall. Bright colors, children's faces, and in the center, Clara, hand outstretched, guiding them forward. The case that once broke the town's heart now inspires its healing. But the movement didn't stop in Redgrove. Other families, inspired by the Montoyas, began petitioning to reopen their loved ones' cold cases. Names that had sat untouched in files for decades began to resurface. Investigators, once skeptical, began to see what was possible when persistence met progress. Clara's story had become more than a cautionary tale. It had become a catalyst. And in remembering Clara, not just her loss, but her light, the question remains: how many more will now find the justice they've waited for too long to receive? The 2009 Texas cold case of Clara Elise Montoya, a 26-year-old preschool teacher who vanished after Sunday service, left a scar on Redgrove and a silence that echoed far beyond the borders of that small town. What began as a baffling disappearance marked by early missteps and unanswered questions evolved into a relentless pursuit of justice powered by science, community, and love. For over a decade, Clara's name was a question without an answer, but the emergence of forensic genealogy and a single degraded DNA sample finally unmasked a man who had once stood unnoticed in the background. Thomas Ray Hollowell's arrest and conviction brought a measure of resolution. Yet even that couldn't undo the loss nor return what was taken. But Clara's story didn't end in the courtroom. Her family's unwavering devotion transformed grief into action. The Clara Grace Foundation became a symbol of what legacy truly means, offering scholarships to future educators, funding DNA research for other unsolved cases, and pushing legislation to prevent others from being forgotten. In a world filled with cold cases, Clara's journey is a powerful reminder. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Let her name be a beacon. Let her memory move us to act. May we never forget Clara's smile. May we honor her by fighting for truth, not just for her, but for the countless others still waiting in the dark. If her story moved you, share it. Speak her name. Support justice. Because behind every unsolved case is a life that mattered.